For decades, the world has watched China rise. It has watched its economy grow, its cities expand, its military modernize, and its global influence spread across every continent. But in recent years, something has shifted. Something has changed. The world is no longer just watching China with curiosity or admiration. It is watching with fear. Deep, genuine, bone-chilling fear. Because China has developed something that the West cannot match. Something that Russia cannot counter. Something that even the United States, with all its technological superiority and military might, does not fully understand. This weapon is not a missile. It is not a bomb. It is not a cyber virus or a stealth aircraft. It is something far more insidious, far more difficult to defend against, and far more capable of tipping the global balance of power in ways that most people have not yet begun to comprehend. The world is terrified of China's new weapon, and the silence surrounding it is deafening. Governments are scrambling to understand its capabilities. Intelligence agencies are pouring billions into research and countermeasures. Military strategists are rewriting their entire playbooks. And ordinary citizens, the people who will be most affected by this shift in power, have no idea what is coming. They see the headlines about tensions in the South China Sea, about trade wars and technology bans, about spy balloons and espionage. But they do not see the bigger picture. They do not see the weapon that is quietly being deployed, not on battlefields, but in laboratories, in factories, in financial markets, and in the very fabric of global society. This weapon is not designed to destroy cities or kill millions. It is designed to do something far more devastating. It is designed to make the West obsolete, to render its military advantages meaningless, to cripple its economy from within, to turn its own systems, its own technologies, its own people into instruments of Chinese power. And the most terrifying part of all is that the West has no answer. It has no countermeasure. It has no plan. Because it never imagined that a weapon like this could exist. And by the time it fully understands what is happening, it may already be too late. This is not science fiction. This is not a movie plot. This is a reality of the 21st century, and it is unfolding right now, in plain sight, while the world looks the other way. To understand why the world is so terrified of China's new weapon, we must first understand the world that existed before it. The world of American dominance. The world of Western technological supremacy. The world where the United States and its allies control the rules of the global order, and everyone else was expected to follow them. For decades, this world was stable. Not necessarily fair, not necessarily just, but stable. The West had the weapons, the money, the technology, and the alliances. It had the aircraft carriers, the stealth bombers, the nuclear submarines, and the satellite networks. It had the Silicon Valley giants, the Wall Street banks, the Ivy League universities, and the Hollywood studios. It had the cultural influence, the economic might, and the military power to enforce its will on every other nation on Earth. China, for most of this period, was a minor player, a poor country emerging from decades of isolation and turmoil, a nation that was more focused on feeding its people than on challenging the global order. But then came the economic reforms of the late 20th century. Then came the opening to the world. Then came the manufacturing boom, the infrastructure explosion, and the rise of the Chinese middle class. And with each passing year, China grew wealthier, more powerful, and more confident. It watched the West closely. It studied its successes. It studied its failures. It learned its strategies. And it waited. By the early 21st century, China had transformed itself into an economic powerhouse. It had become the world's factory, the world's banker, and the world's largest market. It had built the most modern infrastructure on Earth, from high-speed rail networks to massive seaports to gleaming smart cities. It had lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, a feat that no other nation in history had ever achieved. And it had begun to invest in the technologies of the future. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, hypersonic missiles, space exploration, and biotechnology. The West watched all of this with a mixture of admiration and unease. But it did not yet feel threatened, because it still had the weapons. It still had the alliances. It still had the rules. And then came the weapon that changed everything. A weapon that the West had not anticipated. A weapon that did not rely on brute force or financial leverage or political manipulation. A weapon that operated on a different plane entirely. A weapon that was not designed to fight the West on its own terms, but to rewrite the terms of the game itself. And when the West finally realized what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. So, what is this weapon that has the world so terrified? The answer, surprisingly, is not a single device or a single technology. It is a system. A comprehensive, multi-layered, and deeply integrated system of surveillance, control, and influence that China has been quietly building for more than a decade. It is a weapon that operates through the very technologies that the West created and exported. Through smartphones, through social media platforms, through e-commerce networks, through cloud computing, through artificial intelligence, through facial recognition, through predictive analytics, through everything that has become essential to modern life. The West gave the world these technologies. China took them, improved them, and turned them into a weapon. And now, the weapon is being turned back against the West itself. The first layer of this weapon is data. China has amassed more data on its own citizens than any government in history, and it is using that data to build the most sophisticated surveillance system the world has ever known. Facial recognition cameras are everywhere, tracking every movement, every interaction, every transaction. Social credit scores determine who gets loans, who gets jobs, who gets access to education and healthcare. Predictive algorithms identify potential threats before they even materialize, allowing the state to suppress dissent before it can spread. This system is not just about control. It is about total, absolute, and unassailable dominance over every aspect of human life. The second layer is influence. China is using its technological prowess to project power far beyond its borders through its Belt and Road Initiative. It is building infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, creating economic dependencies that give it leverage over dozens of nations. Through its digital Silk Road, it is exporting its surveillance technology to authoritarian regimes around the world, creating a global network of control that mirrors the one it has built at home. Through its media platforms, its cultural exports, and its strategic communications campaigns, it is reshaping global narratives, promoting its own worldview, and undermining the credibility of Western institutions and values. Soft power, once a Western advantage, is now becoming a Chinese weapon. The third layer is military. China has developed hypersonic missiles that can evade any existing defense system. It has built advanced stealth fighters that rival anything in the American arsenal. It has deployed electronic warfare capabilities that can blind and disable enemy sensors. It has constructed artificial islands in the South China Sea, turning them into fortified military bases that threaten the world's most important shipping lanes. It is expanding its navy at a rate that has not been seen since the Cold War, building aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines that are increasingly capable of projecting power far from its own shores. But these conventional weapons are not what the world fears most. What it fears is a combination. The integration of data, influence, and military might into a single, seamless, and unstoppable system of power. And then there is the most terrifying part of all. China's new weapon does not require war to be effective. It does not require conflict or confrontation or even direct aggression. All it requires is time. Time for the dependencies to deepen. Time for the surveillance networks to expand. Time for the influence to spread. Time for the West to become so entangled in Chinese systems, so dependent on Chinese technology, so compromised by Chinese data, that it can no longer resist. By the time the West realizes what is happening, it will have no choice but to accept the new reality, a reality where China is the center and everyone else is just a node in its system. The impact of China's new weapon is already being felt around the world, not on battlefields, but in boardrooms and legislatures and financial markets, and in the daily lives of ordinary people. Every nation, every industry, every individual is being affected, whether they realize it or not. The ripples are spreading outward from Beijing, touching every corner of the globe, and the effects are only going to intensify. In the United States, the government has identified China as its greatest strategic competitor, a threat that it says is more dangerous than any it faced during the Cold War. The Pentagon is pouring billions into new technologies to counter Chinese advances, from hypersonic defense systems to next-generation cyber capabilities. Silicon Valley is scrambling to reduce its dependence on Chinese supply chains, relocating factories, diversifying suppliers, and building new alliances with American and European partners. American universities, once eager to collaborate with Chinese researchers, are now severing ties, citing national security concerns. And American citizens are increasingly being caught in crossfire as the trade war escalates, the tariffs increase, and the price of everyday goods rises. In Europe, the response has been more ambivalent. Some nations, like Germany and France, have sought to maintain their economic ties with China, viewing them as essential to their own prosperity. Others, like the United Kingdom and the Baltic states, have been more cautious, warning of the dangers of over-reliance on Chinese technology and investment. The European Union has struggled to find a unified approach, torn between the desire to maintain economic growth and the growing recognition that China's weapon represents an existential threat to its way of life. But the tension is growing, and with each passing year, the pressure to choose sides becomes more intense. In Asia, the fear is even more acute. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, and India all have watched with alarm as China's military and economic power have grown. They see the islands being built in the South China Sea. They see the military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. They see the economic coercion being used against countries that refuse to bow to Beijing's demands. And they see the weapon being deployed not just against them, but against their own citizens, as Chinese surveillance technology finds its way into their streets, their ports, and their government buildings. The fear is palpable, and it is only going to grow. In the global south, the impact is more complex. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East have welcomed Chinese investment, seeing it as an alternative to Western dominance. But they are increasingly realizing that this investment comes at a price that includes debt dependency, loss of sovereignty, and exposure to Chinese surveillance systems that can be used to monitor their own citizens, their own governments, and their own resources. The weapon that China has built is not just being used against the West. It is being used against everyone. And everyone is beginning to understand that they are not allies. They are targets. The global ripple is spreading. It is touching every nation, every industry, every individual. And the world is terrified, not just because of what China's weapon can do, but because it is already doing it, and there is no way to stop it. And yet, despite the growing fear, there is another reality that the world is reluctant to acknowledge. China's weapon is not invincible. It has vulnerabilities, weaknesses, flaws. It is dependent on technologies that the West created, on supply chains that can be disrupted, on alliances that can be broken. The world is not helpless, but it is divided, and division, in the face of a unified and determined adversary, is the most dangerous vulnerability of all. The United States, China's primary competitor, is itself deeply divided. The political polarization that has gripped the nation for the past decade has made it impossible to craft a coherent strategy for dealing with China. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party agree that China is a threat, but they disagree on everything else. On trade policy, on technology policy, on military policy, on diplomatic engagement, on the role of international institutions, on the priorities that should guide American foreign policy. The result is paralysis, incoherence, and a growing sense of helplessness. Europe is even more divided. The European Union, with its 27 member states and its complex web of national interests, has struggled to agree on a unified response to China's weapon. Some nations want to engage. Some want to confront. Some want to hedge. The internal divisions have allowed China to play divide and conquer, signing separate agreements with individual nations, exploiting their economic vulnerabilities, and weakening the European Union's collective response. The European Union could be a powerful counterweight to Chinese power, but it is not yet, and it may never be. And then there is the rest of the world, the nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where China's weapon is being deployed with increasing sophistication. Some of these nations are becoming Chinese proxies, willingly or unwillingly, serving as nodes of surveillance network, as markets for Chinese technology, as suppliers of raw materials for Chinese industry. Others are resisting, but with limited success, lacking the resources and the political will to counter the Chinese behemoth. The result is a world that is fragmenting into competing spheres of influence, a world that is slowly being divided into Chinese and Western zones, a world that is becoming more dangerous, more uncertain, and more vulnerable to conflict with each passing day. The pivot point has arrived. The decisions that are made in the coming years will determine the course of the 21st century. If the West can unite, can innovate, can rebuild its own technological independence, and can project power in ways that counter Chinese influence, then it may be able to prevent the worst outcomes. But if the West remains divided, if it continues to rely on Chinese technology, if it allows its economic and political vulnerabilities to be exploited, then China's weapon will succeed, and the world as we know it will be transformed beyond recognition. This is not panic. This is a warning that the world must take seriously, because the cost of ignoring it will be far greater than anyone can imagine. So what does the future hold? Two paths, two futures, both terrifying in their own way. But one is a future that the world can survive, and the other is a future that will destroy everything that the West has built over the past 5 centuries. In the first path, the West wakes up. It recognizes the threat that China's weapon poses. It invests in new technologies to counter Chinese surveillance and influence. It builds new alliances with other nations that share its fears. It reconfigures its supply chains to reduce dependence on China. It restores its military capabilities and its strategic confidence. It engages China from a position of strength, not weakness, forcing Beijing to negotiate rather than dictate. In this future, the world remains multipolar, competitive, and uneasy. But it does not collapse. It does not succumb. It survives. In the second path, the West remains divided. It continues to rely on Chinese technology, on Chinese markets, on Chinese data. It allows its economic and political vulnerabilities to be exploited. It fails to develop countermeasures. It loses the technological race. It loses the military balance. It loses its strategic position. And eventually, it loses its freedom. In this future, China consolidates its control over the global system. Surveillance becomes universal. Dissent becomes impossible. Freedom becomes a memory. And the world becomes a global version of the Chinese domestic order. Efficient, prosperous, and utterly devoid of liberty. The question is not whether China will succeed. The question is whether the West will respond. And the answer depends on the choices that are made today by leaders, by citizens, by every person who understands what is at stake. The world is terrified of China's new weapon, but has not yet accepted the full implications. It has not yet understood that the weapon is not just aimed at governments and militaries. It is aimed at the very idea of freedom, at the very concept of individual rights, at the very possibility of human dignity. And if the world does not stand up to it, it will lose all of these things. The map never lies. But the people drawing it always have a reason. We just saw why the world is terrified of China's new weapon. But there is one nation quietly preparing to counter it. That is the next journey. Which future do you believe? Comment Future 1 or Future 2. And subscribe to Atlas Beyond so you never miss the next journey.